Performing electronic music live is incredibly fun and rewarding, but where do you start and how do you build a synth setup that works for the stage? And how do you choose what parts to play live and what parts to have pre-recorded? And how do you actually make the performance feel alive? These are all questions I will be asking today's special guest. She has a lot of experience performing live with her synthesizer setup, and I am super happy to have her as a Summer of Synths guest. Give a warm welcome to Panic Curve.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me, Bo.
If you were to give 3 quick pieces of advice to anyone wanting to start performing electronic music live, what would that be?
So my first piece of advice would be to rehearse your set as often as you can so it is muscle memory by then. My second piece of advice is to prepare some safety nets just in case something goes wrong with your gear. And my third advice is to make a list beforehand of what you have to pack for your gig so you don't forget anything.
So building your hardware synth setup for live performances, how do you pick what synths to use in that setup?
This highly depends on where the gig is, if I have to go by plane, by train, or if I can go by car. If I can go by car, I usually take half my studio with me, with the favorite piece at the moment being the Matriarch by Moog, but it is quite big and heavy for me, so I would have to go by car to take it with me. And if I would have to go by plane, then I would take the OP1 or my Digitone or my iPad even, for example. For bass sounds, I really like the Mother 32 these days, and for pre-recorded sounds, samples and field recordings, I take the Octatrack with me. As a mixer, I have the Soundcraft Notepad 12FX mixer, with which I adjust the volumes of all my devices on stage. And last but not least, I really love the Coco-Quantus-basiert Lombarde because it adds so much character and all those noisy bits to my sets. In general, I really like devices that I can use for several sounds in different parts of my set, so I can keep my setup as small as possible.
When it comes to the music making process, do you make music with live performances in mind, or do you adapt already finished music for the live set? Could you talk us through what your process is like?
I do both actually, depending on the show. For my last set, Moog asked me to compose a set with mainly Moog instruments, which they sent me about 4 weeks before the show. That was of course quite a special request that you don't get every day, and it was very challenging but also very rewarding at the same time. So I knew what instruments I would be taking with me on stage, namely the Matriarch, the Moog Sound Studio, the Octatrack and the Coco-Quantus, and then I started composing with that performance in mind. And I loved every bit of those shows. It was such a lovely experience. If I want to play finished tracks at a show, then I usually remix them a bit for that purpose. I take the main beat and the main melodies of those tracks, for example, and then add some additional sounds to them depending on the gear I have with me on stage. I always try to play as much live as possible, so I also try to translate those tracks as good as I can to the gear I have with me on stage.
Could you perhaps show us and explain how a typical synth setup for a live show works? How is everything connected and how do you actually perform with it?
I don't really have a typical synth set that I always use. It's pretty different from set to set. But let's take the last one, which I composed and played for Moog, as an example. That performance was completely unsynced and I loved playing it a lot because of that reason. It was a very free-floating organic show with field recordings that I played back from the Octatrack. The main sounds were coming from the Matriarch, which I performed a lot on during the show. Then I had the Moog Mother 32 with me, mainly for the bass sounds, and also the DFAM for some percussive sounds. Octatrack, I recorded a short loop from the Matriarch or the Mother 32 onto the Quantas from Electron Octatrack live on stage, and then I could use those instruments to play some other melodies and sounds. To record those loops, I used the aux Synth in pre-fader mode on my Soundcraft Mixer, as I had to record them onto the Quantas without the main instruments being on the PA at the same time. I also took some patch notes with me to set up new sounds on the synthesizers for each track. That is the most tricky part during the performance, as I need to adjust many parameters during the transitions between the single tracks, but I need to be fairly fast so it doesn't take too long. For the sounds that I needed for my tracks but couldn't play live during the set, like field recordings or some additional Matriarch layers, I used the Octatrack, which is perfect for that. At the end of the signal chain, I connect all audio outs from my devices to my mixer, which is a Soundcraft Notepad 12FX, and then send the main mix to the live engineer.
How much of a typical live performance is pre-recorded, and how much do you play live? And how do you decide on what parts to actually play live?
Basically, I try to play as much live as possible without being too stressed. I'm convinced that if I don't have a good time on stage, the audience won't feel it either. So for me, it's more about the overall experience. But if I had to put a number on it, I would say 20 to 30% pre-recorded and the rest live. Coffee time.
In your own experience, what makes a live electronic music performance work for the audience, work for the stage? What gets the audience going, so to speak?
There are several things that come into play, I guess. A great sounding location with a good PA is very important, great sounding instruments, whatever that may mean to you, and as mentioned, an artist who can lean into the music and translate that feeling to the audience. One thing also to consider is that your music will sound very different in that location. It won't be as perfect as in your studio or rehearsal room, and that's totally normal and okay.
So let's talk about gear. What are some gear pieces that you can't live without on the stage?
So at the moment it would be very hard for me to play without my Mother 32 and the Matriarch, as they sound just so gorgeous in my ears. And then also my Quantas from Electron Octatrack. I just love those gritty, noisy bits it adds to my set. And then also my field recordings, or the overall atmosphere and ambience in my sets.
Let's talk about fear. How do you overcome the fear of something going terribly wrong during a live show?
I try to prepare myself for that occasion. With all that gear and all I have to do on stage, there is always something going wrong. Usually it's something so small nobody notices, but for the bigger hiccups, I usually have some samples or recordings on my iPhone, iPad, Octatrack that I could play back to buy myself some time to figure out what went wrong. It might also be a good idea to be able to improvise if your music allows for it.
Before we move on with the video, I just want to mention our Summer of Synths sponsor, DistroKid. So if the Summer of Synths videos have inspired you to create some music and you want to release it, you should use DistroKid. They're very quick to get the music onto stores, and it only costs $20 a year, and you can upload unlimited amounts to all the relevant stores like Spotify, iTunes. We got Amazon Music, we got Tidal. It's also super easy to collaborate using DistroKid, so if you are working on music with with other people and you need to share the revenue between each other. It's super easy to set up. You basically just insert the emails of the people that you're working with, and it's pretty much that simple, and then they get a cut of whatever revenue you're making from your music. So definitely check out DistroKid. I've linked them down below. If you use the link, you support Summer of Synths and you get a discount. Thank you so much, DistroKid, for all the years of supporting Bobeats, and thank you for supporting Summer of Synths. Lastly, what is one big thing that someone should avoid when building a synth rig for live electronic music?
Don't make it too complicated. Build yourself a rig that you're comfortable with, that you rehearse a lot, and that you know in and out, at least the things you need to do on stage. I think you also have kids, Bo. Over and out. Bye.
Thank you so much, Panic Girl, for being a Summer of Synths guest, and thank you, DistroKid, for sponsoring this year's event. Summer of Synths is an event where I invite other creators to my channel during the summer months. I provide them with a budget and I help them with video ideas and feedback on the videos, so make sure to check out this year's sponsor, DistroKid, and of course check out all the Summer of Synth guest creators. So thank you so much for being here and have a great summer.